Imagine a human being standing quietly somewhere. Maybe it's in a mosque during the early morning. Maybe it's in a church when the room is silent. Maybe it's simply a person sitting on the edge of their bed late at night when the world has finally slowed down. They close their eyes. Their body becomes still. Their breathing becomes softer and slower. And their attention shifts away from the outside world toward something that cannot be seen or touched. We call this prayer. Now, if we approach this as a curious physicist rather than a philosopher, the first thing we want to ask is a very simple question. What changes physically when this begins? What happens inside the brain the moment someone starts to pray? To understand that, we have to begin with something extremely ordinary: attention. Most of the time, the human mind behaves like a crowded marketplace. Thoughts are constantly moving in and out. One moment you are thinking about something that happened yesterday. A moment later you are planning tomorrow. Then suddenly you remember an embarrassing thing you said 10 years ago. Then a song lyric appears for no reason. This constant mental motion is not unusual. In fact, brain researchers have a name for it. They call it the default mode network. This is a system of brain regions that becomes active whenever the mind is not focused on a specific task. When you are daydreaming, worrying, imagining conversations, replaying memories, or simply letting your mind wander, this network is busy. In other words, your brain is almost never quiet. It is constantly simulating the past, predicting the future, and constructing stories about yourself and the world around you. Now something interesting happens when a person begins to pray. Attention narrows. Instead of allowing thoughts to wander in every direction, the mind begins to focus on something specific. It might be a set of repeated words. It might be a feeling of gratitude. It might be a request or reflection or simply silence directed towards something the person believes is listening. From the outside, this might not look like much is happening. But inside the brain, measurable changes begin to occur. Brain imaging studies suggest that when attention becomes focused like this, activity shifts away from the wandering networks and toward areas involved in concentration and control. One of the most important of these areas is the prefrontal cortex, located near the front of the brain. This region helps you guide attention, regulate impulses, and decide what deserves focus. A useful way to imagine this is to picture a large room filled with people talking all at once. Everyone is speaking, no one is listening carefully, and the noise is chaotic. Then suddenly someone stands up and begins speaking clearly. Gradually the conversations fade, and people turn their attention toward that single voice. Something like that happens in the brain when attention becomes focused during prayer. The background chatter of thoughts does not necessarily disappear completely, but it becomes quieter, more organized, less dominant. Instead of 1,000 mental voices competing for attention, the brain begins aligning itself around a single intention. This shift may sound small, but from the perspective of neuroscience, it is actually quite significant. Attention is one of the most powerful tools the brain possesses. Where attention goes, neural activity follows, and prayer at its simplest physical level begins with the deliberate act of directing attention towards something that is not part of the immediate physical environment. That alone already tells us something fascinating about the human mind. It is capable of turning away from the sensory world and becoming absorbed in an internal one. As attention becomes focused, another change begins quietly in the background, and this one involves something very physical: breathing. Most people never think about how closely breathing is tied to mental states, yet it is one of the fastest ways the body can shift from tension to calm. When a person is stressed, breathing usually becomes shallow and quick. The chest rises and falls rapidly, and the body prepares itself for action. This pattern is part of an ancient survival system that humans share with many animals. But when someone begins to pray, the opposite often happens. Breathing slows. Sometimes this happens intentionally, and sometimes it happens naturally without the person even noticing. Words are spoken more slowly. Pauses appear between phrases, and the body becomes still. The rhythm of the breath gradually stretches out. A breath comes in, then out, with more time in between. This small shift has surprisingly large consequences for the body. Inside your nervous system, there are two major operating modes constantly balancing each other. One is often called the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body for action. When it becomes active, the heart beats faster, muscles tense, and the body becomes alert. This is the familiar fight or flight response. The other mode is the parasympathetic nervous system. This system does almost the opposite. It slows the heart, relaxes the muscles, and encourages digestion, repair, and recovery. If the sympathetic system is like pressing the accelerator in a car, the parasympathetic system is like gently pressing the brake. Breathing turns out to be one of the easiest ways to influence this balance. Slow breathing sends signals through the body that activate the parasympathetic system. Heart rate begins to decrease slightly. Blood pressure may drop a little. Muscles release tension that may have been there without the person even realizing it. One of the key players in this process is something called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is a long communication pathway that runs from the brain down through the neck and into many organs in the chest and abdomen. It helps regulate heart rate, digestion, and other automatic body processes. You can think of it as a kind of information highway between the brain and the body. When breathing slows and deepens, signals travel along this nerve telling the body that conditions are safe enough to relax. The heart becomes more stable in its rhythm. The body begins shifting away from emergency mode and toward maintenance mode. This is important because modern life often keeps people in a mild state of stress for long periods of time. Work, noise, constant information, and social pressures keep the nervous system slightly activated. The body behaves as if something important might happen at any moment. Prayer, like other contemplative practices, can interrupt that pattern. The quiet posture, slower breathing, and focused attention create conditions where the parasympathetic system becomes more dominant. From a purely biological perspective, the body interprets this combination of signals as a message the immediate environment is stable enough to lower its defenses. What makes this interesting is that the body does not necessarily know why the person is breathing slowly or standing quietly. It simply responds to the signals it receives. If breathing slows, if muscles relax, if attention becomes steady, the nervous system reacts in predictable ways. So in that sense, prayer is not only a mental act, it is also a physical pattern that influences some of the most fundamental control systems in the human body. And all of this begins with something so simple that it is easy to overlook. A slower breath moving quietly in and out of the lungs. As the body settles into slower breathing and a calmer nervous system, another layer of change begins inside the brain. This layer is chemical. The brain communicates using tiny molecules called neurotransmitters. Every thought, emotion, and perception you experience is influenced by these chemicals moving between neurons. They act like messengers carrying signals from one cell to another, shaping how the brain interprets the world. When a person enters a focused, contemplative state like prayer, scientists have observed shifts in several of these chemical systems. The most commonly discussed ones include dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. Each of these molecules plays a different role in how we experience reality. Dopamine is often associated with motivation and meaning. It is released when the brain recognizes something important or rewarding. People often think of dopamine as the pleasure chemical, but that description is incomplete. Dopamine is more accurately about significance. It helps the brain decide what matters and what deserves attention. When someone prays, especially with a sense of purpose or emotional investment, the brain may treat the act as meaningful behavior. That sense of meaning can influence dopamine pathways, reinforcing the feeling that the activity is important and worth repeating. Serotonin plays a different role. It helps regulate mood, emotional stability, and general well-being. Changes in serotonin activity are often linked to feelings of calm, balance, and emotional regulation. This may partly explain why many people report feeling more emotionally settled after prayer or other contemplative practices. But perhaps the most intriguing molecule in this context is oxytocin. Oxytocin is sometimes called the bonding hormone because it plays a role in social trust and connection. When people hug, form friendships, or care for children, oxytocin levels can increase. It helps strengthen the sense that another person is close, safe, and emotionally significant. Now here is the curious part. Some studies suggest that oxytocin can also increase during spiritual or prayerful experiences. This means the brain may be engaging some of the same biological systems used in human relationships. In other words, when a person prays, the brain may interpret the situation in a way that resembles social interaction. Even if no other human being is present, the neural systems associated with connection and trust may still become active. From the brain's perspective, prayer may sometimes resemble a kind of conversation. This does not necessarily mean the brain is inventing the experience, nor does it prove that anything external is responding. It simply tells us that the brain is capable of generating the feeling of relational presence through its own chemistry. To understand why this might happen, it helps to remember that human brains evolved in intensely social environments. For most of human history, survival depended on cooperation, communication, and trust within small groups. Because of this, our brains became extremely sensitive to the signals of relationship. Tone of voice, facial expression, emotional intention, all of these became deeply wired into our neural systems. So when a person directs attention towards something they believe can hear or understand them, the brain may activate those familiar social circuits. The same biological machinery used for human connection may also participate in experiences of prayer. What makes this fascinating is that the brain does not strictly separate the internal world from the external one. If a thought feels real enough, the body and brain can respond to it almost as if it were part of the physical environment. This tells us something important about the human mind. Our experiences are not shaped only by what is physically present around us. They are also shaped by the meanings and relationships the brain constructs internally. Prayer appears to operate within that complex space where biology, perception, and meaning all interact at the same time. As attention becomes focused, breathing slows, and chemical signals begin shifting inside the brain. Another noticeable change appears in the body. Movement decreases. This might sound simple, almost trivial, but from a biological perspective it is surprisingly important. Human bodies are rarely completely still. Even when you think you are resting, your muscles are constantly making tiny adjustments. Your eyes move several times every second. Your posture shifts. Your hands fidget. The brain is continuously sending signals to maintain balance and coordinate motion. All of this requires energy. The brain itself is already an energy-hungry organ. Although it makes up only a small fraction of the body's weight, it consumes a large share of the body's total energy. A significant portion of that energy goes toward controlling movement and processing sensory information from the outside world. When someone enters a quiet state of prayer, many of these activities begin to slow down. The body often becomes very still. Hands may remain in one position. The head may lower slightly. The eyes might close, reducing visual input from the environment. From the brain's perspective, this changes the balance of what it needs to pay attention to. When the eyes close, the enormous stream of visual information from the outside world decreases dramatically. Vision normally occupies a large part of the brain's processing power. Without that constant flow of images, the brain suddenly has fewer external signals demanding attention. At the same time, reduced movement means the motor system is working less intensely. Muscles are no longer making constant adjustments, and the brain regions that coordinate motion can become quieter. This creates an interesting situation. Energy that would normally be spent responding to the outside world becomes available for monitoring internal signals. Scientists sometimes refer to this as increased interoception, which means awareness of the body from the inside. Interoception includes things like noticing your heartbeat, sensing the rhythm of your breathing, or becoming aware of subtle emotional sensations in the chest or stomach. Most of the time, people are not very aware of these signals because the brain is busy dealing with the outside world. Traffic, noise, conversations, screens, movement, and visual stimuli constantly compete for attention. But when the body becomes still and external input decreases, those internal signals can become more noticeable. You may begin to feel your breathing more clearly. The slow expansion of the lungs, the gentle release of air, the slight pause before the next breath. You might notice the steady rhythm of the heart or the warmth in your hands. This shift toward internal awareness is common in many contemplative practices, including meditation and prayer. From a scientific perspective, it is not mysterious that this happens. The brain always has access to internal bodily signals, but it does not always prioritize them. When the outside world becomes quieter, those internal signals rise into awareness more easily. What is interesting is how people interpret these sensations. For some individuals, this increased internal awareness simply feels like calmness or relaxation. For others, it becomes a powerful emotional experience. The slowing of the body, the quieting of thought, and the heightened awareness of internal signals can create the sense that something deeper is happening. The body, in a sense, becomes a quieter instrument. When the noise of movement and sensory input fades, the subtler rhythms inside the body become easier to perceive. Breathing, heartbeat, and emotional sensations form a kind of internal landscape that the mind can observe more clearly. So while prayer may appear outwardly as a person simply standing or sitting quietly, internally the shift towards stillness is reorganizing how the brain allocates attention and energy. Less attention is directed outward, more attention turns inward, and in that quiet space, the body becomes something that the mind can listen to with greater clarity than it usually does during the busy movement of everyday life. As the body grows quieter and attention turns inward, a deeper question begins to appear. Many people who pray do not simply experience calm breathing or relaxed muscles. They often describe something more complex, a strong sense that the moment carries meaning. That sense of meaning is an interesting problem for science. Human brains are not passive recording devices. They are constantly trying to interpret events, searching for patterns, causes, and intentions behind what happens around them. This ability is extremely useful for survival. If you hear a sudden sound in the bushes, your brain quickly tries to determine whether it was the wind or an animal. If someone looks at you in a certain way, your brain immediately tries to guess what they might be thinking. Over millions of years, the human brain evolved to become very good at detecting agency, which means recognizing when something might be caused by a thinking being. Imagine early humans walking through a forest long before cities or technology existed. If they heard movement in the grass, it was safer to assume that something might be there rather than ignore it. If the brain guessed wrong and it was only the wind, nothing serious happened. But if the brain guessed wrong and it was actually a predator, the consequences could be fatal. Because of this, natural selection favored brains that were highly sensitive to signs of intention and presence. This tendency still exists today. Humans easily interpret the world in terms of intentions. We see faces in clouds, we talk to pets as if they understand complex language, and we instinctively assume that actions usually have someone behind them. Now consider what happens during prayer. A person directs their attention towards something they believe can hear them. They might speak words silently or out loud. They might express gratitude, ask questions, or reflect on events in their life. From the outside, this might look like someone speaking into empty space. But from the brain's perspective, something more interesting may be happening. The brain may activate the same circuits it uses during real conversations with other people. Regions that help us understand the thoughts and intentions of others can become active when we imagine interacting with another mind. One of the key abilities humans possess is the capacity to simulate other minds internally. You can imagine how a friend might react to news, predict what someone might say in a conversation, or mentally replay discussions that happened earlier in the day. This ability allows humans to maintain social relationships even when the other person is not physically present. Prayer may use some of the same mental machinery. When someone speaks or thinks as if they are addressing a listener, the brain's social systems may engage. The experience can feel relational even though no other human being is visible in the room. This does not necessarily tell us whether anything external is responding. Science cannot easily measure that. What it does tell us is that the brain is capable of generating the experience of connection using the same neural tools that normally operate in human relationships. Because of this, prayer often feels different from simply sitting quietly and thinking. The presence of an imagined listener can transform internal reflection into something that resembles dialogue. And dialogue has a special place in human psychology. Humans are social creatures. Our brains are designed to function within networks of communication and trust. When those social circuits become active, emotions and attention often become stronger. So the feeling of meaning during prayer may arise partly from the brain interpreting the situation as an interaction with another mind. Whether that interpretation reflects something purely internal or something beyond the brain remains an open question. But the biological mechanisms that produce the feeling of significance are beginning to become clearer. The human brain is built to search for intention, connection, and meaning. When those systems activate, experiences often feel deeper and more important than ordinary moments. Prayer appears to sit directly at the intersection of those systems. At this point, it helps to step back and examine a simple thought experiment. Thought experiments are useful tools in science because they allow us to isolate certain ideas without needing complicated equipment. Instead of measuring things in a laboratory, we imagine a situation carefully and ask what would happen inside it. So imagine two people sitting alone in separate rooms. The rooms are identical. The lighting is the same. The temperature is the same. Both individuals sit in a quiet chair with their eyes closed. Now consider the first person. This person is reflecting silently on their life. They are thinking about the past few days, noticing their emotions, perhaps feeling gratitude for certain events. Their breathing is slow, their body relaxed, and their attention is directed inward. From the outside, this person appears calm and thoughtful. Now consider the second person. This individual is also sitting quietly with their eyes closed. Their breathing is slow and steady, their muscles relaxed. But instead of simple reflection, they are directing their thoughts toward what they believe is a listening presence. They might be speaking silently, forming sentences in their mind as if addressing someone who can hear them. Physically, these two situations might look almost identical. If scientists placed sensors on both individuals, many of the measurements might be quite similar. Their heart rates might slow in comparable ways. Their breathing patterns might become steady and deep. Brain regions involved in attention and emotional regulation might show activity in both cases. From a biological standpoint, the bodies could appear to be doing nearly the same thing. Yet the experiences reported by the two people might feel very different. The first person might describe the moment as quiet reflection or calm observation. The second person might describe it as communication, connection, or even guidance. This difference is important because it reveals something about the limits of measurement. Science is extremely good at measuring physical processes. We can detect electrical signals in neurons, track blood flow in the brain, and record the rhythms of the heart and lungs. These measurements provide valuable information about what the body is doing. But there is another layer of reality that is much harder to measure directly: subjective experience. Subjective experience is the personal, internal feeling of being aware. It includes things like the sensation of joy, the feeling of sadness, the experience of color, and the sense of meaning in a moment. Only the person having the experience can fully access it. Two people may show similar brain activity patterns while reporting completely different inner experiences. One person might feel calm while another feels profound emotion. One might experience silence while another experiences a sense of presence. The scientific instruments can record the biological activity, but they cannot directly observe the experience itself. This creates a gap between what can be measured and what is felt. When researchers study prayer, they can observe changes in breathing, heart rate, and brain activity. These measurements tell us something real about the physical processes involved, but they do not fully capture the personal meaning that individuals attach to the experience. The thought experiment highlights a central difficulty in studying practices like prayer. Two outwardly similar situations can produce very different inner realities. And because inner experience cannot be directly shared or measured in the same way as physical data, understanding the full nature of those experiences becomes one of the most challenging problems in science. It forces researchers to confront a fundamental question. How do physical processes inside the brain give rise to the rich and varied experiences that people report when they turn their attention inward? When scientists try to understand what happens during prayer, one of the main tools they use is brain imaging. These technologies allow researchers to observe which areas of the brain become more active or less active during certain mental states. Although these measurements cannot tell us everything about the experience itself, they can reveal patterns that help us understand how the brain organizes attention and emotion. Several brain regions appear repeatedly in studies of prayer and other contemplative practices. One of the most important is the anterior cingulate cortex. This area sits near the center of the brain and plays a role in managing attention and regulating emotional responses. When a person tries to maintain focus on a specific thought or intention, the anterior cingulate cortex helps stabilize that focus. It also helps the brain monitor internal conflicts, such as when distractions appear and attention needs to be redirected. During prayer, especially when someone repeats certain phrases or maintains a deliberate focus, this region often shows increased activity. That makes sense because sustaining attention on a single idea requires constant guidance from the brain's control systems. The mind naturally drifts, and the brain must repeatedly bring it back to the intended focus. Another interesting region involved in these experiences is the temporal parietal junction. This part of the brain plays an important role in understanding other people's thoughts and intentions. It helps humans imagine what someone else might be thinking or feeling. When you try to predict how a friend will react to something you say, this region becomes active. This ability is often called theory of mind. It allows humans to treat other individuals as minds with their own perspectives and intentions. What makes this region interesting in the context of prayer is that it sometimes becomes active even when the person is physically alone. When someone directs thoughts toward a perceived listener, the brain may engage the same neural systems it normally uses when interacting with other people. In other words, the brain may treat prayer as a kind of social interaction. The experience might involve many of the same mental processes used when speaking to another human being. The brain organizes thoughts into sentences, anticipates responses, and interprets emotions in relation to an imagined partner in communication. Another region that shows changes during contemplative states is the posterior parietal cortex. This area contributes to the brain's sense of spatial orientation and helps maintain the boundary between the body and the surrounding environment. It helps you know where your body ends and where the outside world begins. In certain deep contemplative states, activity in this region appears to decrease. When this happens, people sometimes report unusual sensations involving the boundary of the self. Some describe feeling less separated from their surroundings, as if the distinction between self and world becomes softer or less rigid. These reports are difficult to interpret scientifically, but the neural patterns provide some clues. If the brain region responsible for maintaining spatial boundaries becomes quieter, the experience of separation might become less prominent in awareness. This does not necessarily mean the boundaries themselves disappear in a physical sense. The body remains exactly where it is, but the brain's representation of those boundaries may become less dominant in conscious experience. Taken together, these brain regions illustrate something important about prayer. It is not controlled by a single part of the brain. Instead, it appears to involve a coordinated network of systems responsible for attention, emotion, social understanding, and self-awareness. The brain organizes these systems into a particular pattern during contemplative states. Attention becomes steady, emotional regulation improves, social cognition may activate, and the sense of self can shift slightly in awareness. Each of these processes contributes a piece to the overall experience. What the brain imaging reveals is that prayer is not simply a vague emotional state. It corresponds to identifiable patterns of activity within several major neural systems that shape how humans perceive themselves and their relationship to the world around them. At this point, a natural question begins to appear. If scientists can observe breathing changes, nervous system shifts, chemical signals, and patterns of brain activity, then why is it still so difficult to explain prayer completely? The answer lies in the limits of what scientific tools are designed to measure. Science works best when it studies things that can be observed from the outside. A physicist can measure the motion of a planet. A chemist can measure how molecules interact. A biologist can examine cells under a microscope and track how they behave. All of these things share an important feature. They exist as public events. Multiple observers can look at them, measure them, and confirm the results independently. But experiences such as prayer introduce a different kind of phenomenon. They involve private experience. Private experiences are not directly visible to anyone except the person having them. You can describe what you feel, but another person cannot step inside your mind and observe the experience in the same way a scientist observes a chemical reaction. This creates a challenge. Imagine trying to study dreams. Scientists can measure brain activity while someone sleeps. They can record eye movements, electrical patterns, and changes in breathing. But the dream itself, the story, the images, the emotions, exists only in the mind of the dreamer. The only access researchers have is through the dreamer's description after waking up. Prayer shares a similar difficulty. A researcher can record the electrical activity of neurons and observe which parts of the brain are active. These measurements provide useful information about the physical processes involved, but the deeper elements of the experience, the sense of meaning, connection, or presence remain internal to the person experiencing them. This does not mean those experiences are imaginary or unimportant. It simply means they exist in a domain that science cannot directly observe. To understand this more clearly, it helps to think about a simple analogy. Imagine trying to understand music while being allowed to study only the vibrations of air molecules. You could measure the frequencies of the sound waves. You could record the exact pattern of vibrations produced by each instrument. You could map the physics of every note with incredible precision. But none of those measurements would fully capture what the music feels like to a listener. The emotional response to a melody exists at a different level than the physical movement of air. The same idea applies to many human experiences. Science can measure the biological processes associated with emotions, thoughts, and perceptions. It can track the electrical signals that move through neurons and the chemicals that influence mood. But those measurements describe the mechanism, not necessarily the experience itself. Prayer seems to exist at the intersection of these two layers. On one layer, it is clearly a biological process. Neurons fire, hormones shift, breathing changes, and specific brain regions become active. All of this can be observed and studied with increasing accuracy. On another layer, prayer is a subjective experience filled with personal meaning, interpretation, and awareness. That layer cannot be captured completely by measuring physical signals. This gap between measurable activity and lived experience is one of the deepest puzzles in modern science. Researchers can map the brain in extraordinary detail, yet the question of how physical processes give rise to conscious experience remains unresolved. Because prayer operates directly within the realm of conscious experience, it naturally falls into this difficult territory. The science can describe the physical side with growing precision, but the inner dimension, the way the experience actually feels from the inside, remains something that can only be known by the person living through it. To understand why experiences like prayer are so difficult to explain completely, it helps to think about the difference between describing a process and understanding its meaning. Imagine that scientists wanted to explain a piece of music in purely physical terms. They could begin by studying the vibrations in the air. Every musical note is simply a pattern of pressure waves traveling through space. Instruments produce these waves at precise frequencies, and microphones can measure them with incredible accuracy. Researchers could map every sound in a song. They could calculate the amplitude of each vibration, the timing of each note, and the way those vibrations move through the air toward the listener's ear. From a physics standpoint, the description could be perfectly complete. But now imagine asking a different question. Why does a certain melody make someone feel emotional? The physical description alone does not answer that question. The vibrations themselves do not contain sadness, nostalgia, or joy. They are simply patterns in moving air. The emotional meaning appears only when those vibrations are interpreted by a human mind. Something similar may be happening with many inner experiences, including prayer. When a person prays, measurable physical events occur in the brain. Neurons exchange electrical signals. Chemical messengers move between cells. Blood flow shifts to certain regions as the brain becomes active in particular patterns. These processes are real and observable, much like the sound waves produced by a musical instrument. But the experience of meaning that many people report during prayer may exist at a different level, just as the feeling of music exists beyond the physical vibrations themselves. This does not mean that meaning floats outside the brain in some mysterious way. It simply suggests that meaning emerges from complex patterns of neural activity that are not easily reduced to simple measurements. The brain is an enormously intricate system. It contains billions of neurons, each connected to thousands of others. These networks constantly exchange signals, forming patterns that shift every moment. Within those patterns, experiences arise. A memory is not located in a single neuron. An emotion is not produced by a single chemical. Instead, they appear through the interaction of many systems working together. Prayer may activate a unique combination of these systems. Attention becomes focused. Emotional regulation stabilizes. Social cognition may activate as the brain interprets the moment as communication. Bodily awareness increases as the body becomes still and breathing slows. All of these processes interact, creating a complex internal state. From the outside, scientists can observe pieces of this pattern. Brain scans reveal which regions become active. Hormone measurements reveal chemical changes. Sensors can record heart rate and breathing rhythms. But these measurements are like studying the vibrations of air in the music analogy. They reveal the physical structure of the event without fully capturing the lived experience. The mind then interprets this complex internal state. It assigns meaning to the sensations, thoughts, and emotions that appear. For one person, the moment might feel like peaceful reflection. For another, it may feel like deep connection or communication. This interpretation is shaped by personal beliefs, cultural background, memories, and expectations. Because of this, two people may experience the same physical processes but describe the meaning in very different ways. The challenge for science is that meaning does not exist as a simple measurable quantity. It arises from how the brain organizes information and how a person understands their own experience. Prayer, like music, may involve layers that operate simultaneously. A physical layer that can be measured and an experiential layer that must be understood through the perspective of the person living it. By this point, it becomes clear that what we know about prayer is fascinating but incomplete. Science can describe its physical and neurological correlates in remarkable detail, yet there remains a part of the experience that eludes measurement. To summarize what we can observe, prayer has multiple effects on the human body and brain that are both consistent and measurable. One of the most obvious changes occurs in the nervous system. Slow, steady breathing activates the parasympathetic system, which reduces heart rate, relaxes muscles, and promotes a general sense of calm. At the same time, the sympathetic system, the body's fight or flight response, becomes less dominant. These changes can be tracked through heart rate variability, respiratory patterns, and nervous system markers such as vagus nerve activity. The body physically transitions from a state of alert readiness into a state of recovery and maintenance. At the chemical level, shifts in neurotransmitters occur. Dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin are among the most studied. Dopamine helps the brain assign significance to the act of prayer, reinforcing focus and attentional stability. Serotonin contributes to mood regulation, creating emotional steadiness that many people report as calmness or relief from stress. Oxytocin, often associated with bonding and social connection, may increase as well, suggesting that the brain interprets certain prayer experiences as relational or connected, even in the absence of another human being. Brain imaging shows consistent patterns as well. Attention networks, especially the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, become more active, helping maintain focus and suppress distractions. Areas involved in understanding others' thoughts, like the temporal parietal junction, can activate even when the person is alone, indicating that the brain may treat prayer as a social or interactive process. Meanwhile, regions involved in defining the boundary between self and environment, such as the posterior parietal cortex, may quiet down, allowing for a sense of unity or reduced self-focus. All of these observations are real, measurable, and reproducible across many studies and across multiple contemplative practices. They indicate that prayer produces a specific physiological and neurological state in the human body. That state has predictable effects on attention, emotion, cardiovascular function, and interoception, the awareness of internal bodily signals. These are solid facts that science can describe with clarity. What science does not yet know is just as important. It cannot fully explain why these changes produce the profound subjective experiences reported by many people. Why does the same combination of focused attention, slow breathing, and chemical shifts feel deeply meaningful to one person and merely relaxing to another? Why do some experiences during prayer evoke awe, connection, or a sense of something greater, while others remain purely physical and mental? The gap between measurable processes and subjective meaning remains one of the most fundamental mysteries in neuroscience and consciousness studies. We also do not yet know the precise mechanisms by which the brain generates the sense of connection or significance. While we can identify which regions are involved, the specific patterns of neural interaction that give rise to the feeling of meaning, purpose, or relational awareness are still largely a mystery. Science can describe the machinery, but it cannot yet describe the emergent phenomena that arise from it. Even more broadly, science has not solved the problem of consciousness itself. How do physical processes in the brain create the rich inner life that people experience? Prayer operates entirely within that realm, intertwining physiology, chemistry, neural activity, and subjective awareness in a way that is measurable on some levels, but fundamentally elusive on others. It highlights the distinction between what can be observed externally and what is experienced internally. The lesson is both humbling and profound. Science can reveal the mechanisms behind prayer, but the inner experience, the sense of meaning, connection, and presence, remains largely inaccessible to external measurement. Yet that inner experience is precisely what gives prayer its significance to human beings. It exists at the intersection of the measurable and the ineffable, showing us that reality has layers that our instruments can touch but cannot fully encompass. At the heart of the mystery of prayer lies consciousness itself. Consciousness is the phenomenon of being aware, of having an inner life, of experiencing sensations, thoughts, emotions, and meaning. It is what allows a person to notice their own heartbeat, to feel gratitude, or to sense connection. Yet consciousness has an unusual property: it is private. Unlike the flow of electricity through a wire or the orbit of a planet, consciousness cannot be directly observed from the outside. Only the person experiencing it has access to it. This is why studying phenomena like prayer presents such a challenge. The biological processes are measurable, but the awareness that experiences them exists in a domain that science can only approach indirectly. Science has developed extraordinary tools for mapping and measuring the brain. Functional MRI and other imaging technologies can show which regions of the brain become active during prayer. Electroencephalography can track patterns of electrical activity over milliseconds. Hormone levels can be measured in the blood. Heart rate, breathing, and even subtle muscular activity can be monitored with high precision. All of these tools allow scientists to map the physical correlates of prayer with impressive detail. Yet despite this, there is a layer that remains inaccessible: the subjective, qualitative experience. The way a person feels while praying, the emotional depth, the perceived connection, the sense of something beyond ordinary awareness cannot be directly measured. Two individuals may exhibit nearly identical brain activity, heart rate, and breathing patterns, but describe the experience in radically different ways. One might feel profound awe or connection, while the other experiences calm reflection or focused attention. The objective measurements capture the physical process, but do not fully capture the felt experience. This limitation highlights an essential distinction between the mechanisms of prayer and the phenomenology of prayer. Mechanisms can be mapped and quantified. The flow of neurotransmitters, the shifts in brain regions, the changes in heart rate, all of these can be recorded. Phenomenology, however, exists entirely within the first-person perspective. It is the dimension of lived experience that cannot be fully reconstructed from outside observation. This is why even with complete knowledge of the body and brain, science cannot yet fully explain what prayer feels like from the inside. The private nature of consciousness raises a philosophical implication for science. The universe, as studied by physics, chemistry, and biology, is often described in objective terms: particles, forces, energy, matter. But consciousness does not appear in any equation. The brain can be modeled as an electrochemical system, yet the inner experience, the qualitative, what it is like to be aware, remains unexplained. Prayer exists entirely within this realm of consciousness, demonstrating how human experience can operate at the intersection of measurable processes and subjective awareness. This perspective challenges a common assumption that everything meaningful must be directly observable. Prayer reminds us that human beings interact with the world in ways that cannot always be reduced to data. Our inner lives are real, powerful, and shaped by biological systems, yet they transcend simple measurement. The private, subjective dimension of prayer reveals the gap between knowing how the body and brain work and knowing what it feels like to live through an experience. The study of prayer, therefore, is not just about understanding a spiritual practice. It is a window into the mystery of consciousness itself. It highlights the limitations of objective measurement and shows that certain aspects of reality, our inner lives, our awareness, our sense of meaning, resist being fully captured by instruments, charts, or equations. Consciousness is a phenomenon that exists on the border between biology, physics, and experience, and prayer is one of the clearest examples of how this border operates in everyday human life. It forces us to confront the profound fact that reality has layers. The physical, measurable layer exists and is fully accessible to scientific observation. Above it, there is a layer of subjective experience that is deeply real, but fundamentally private. Prayer occurs precisely at that intersection, making it both accessible to study and impossible to fully define. And in doing so, it points toward one of the most profound questions about the universe: how consciousness emerges from matter and how inner experience shapes our perception of reality. What becomes clear when examining prayer from a scientific perspective is that it operates at multiple levels simultaneously. On one level, there is the measurable, physical layer. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens, muscles relax, and neural circuits shift into distinctive patterns of activity. Neurotransmitters fluctuate, and regions of the brain responsible for attention, emotion regulation, and social cognition become active. These changes are observable, consistent, and reproducible. They show that prayer is not just a subjective phenomenon, it has tangible physiological effects on the body and brain. Yet, alongside these measurable changes exists a second, equally real layer: subjective experience. This layer is private, elusive, and not directly observable. It encompasses what the moment feels like from the inside, the sense of focus, emotional resonance, or connection that a person experiences during prayer. It is the awareness of one's own consciousness interacting with something perceived as significant. Science can identify neural correlates, but it cannot fully capture the richness, depth, or personal meaning of the experience. One way to think about this is to consider a map versus the territory it represents. The map, the data collected through neuroimaging, heart rate monitoring, or chemical analysis, can be incredibly detailed. It shows patterns, relationships, and structures. It can even predict certain responses under controlled conditions. But the map is not the territory itself. It cannot recreate the lived experience of being a conscious mind in the moment of prayer. The textures of feeling, the sense of presence, and the perception of meaning exist in the territory, not on the map. This distinction is crucial because it highlights why human experiences such as prayer are inherently difficult to explain fully. The brain, body, and nervous system provide the necessary machinery for the experience, but the experience itself is more than the sum of these parts. Consciousness transforms physiological processes into awareness, the combination of focused attention, slower breathing, chemical modulation, and neural coordination creates a fertile environment for the emergence of subjective experience. Yet emergence does not imply mystery in the supernatural sense. It highlights that complex systems often produce properties that cannot be predicted from their individual components alone. Prayer also illustrates the interaction between internal and external perception. Even when no other person is physically present, the brain treats the moment as relational. Social cognition circuits may activate, giving the sense that one is communicating with something outside the self. These systems evolved to manage relationships, cooperation, and trust within groups. When applied in the context of prayer, they create a profound sense of connection that feels real and meaningful, even in the absence of observable social interaction. The implications extend beyond prayer itself. They touch on the nature of consciousness, the limits of scientific measurement, and the complexity of human experience. Human awareness is capable of generating rich inner realities, interpreting physiological signals, and constructing meaning in ways that extend beyond what instruments can measure. It demonstrates that reality, as experienced by humans, is not composed solely of objective phenomena, but also includes layers of subjective, meaning that emerge from the interaction of body, brain, and mind. Understanding prayer in this way encourages a more nuanced view of human experience. It reveals that phenomena traditionally considered spiritual or mystical can be studied scientifically without reducing them to mere mechanical processes. At the same time, it acknowledges the irreducible reality of subjective experience. Prayer exists in the space where the measurable and the ineffable intersect, a vivid illustration of how human consciousness interprets, transforms, and interacts with the physical world.